Hey guys, what's up? Kid here, Burn1, Shadowverse Evolved channel, as always, bringing you our first BPO7 Verdant Steel deck profile. This one is on Mono Abyss. I've been messing around with this list a lot. We know it's going to be a relatively popular deck. After playing it a bit, I realized the deck actually takes a little bit more skill than mindlessly dropping mono as soon as possible. But we'll talk about that as we get into the deck profile itself, so let's jump right into it. Alright, so here's the list itself. This is a relatively super standard list. After playing the deck a lot, I'm not sure if there's any real changes I would personally do. It probably just really comes down to how you would change the deck for your personal local meta. But honestly, I think this is kind of just the list you should be going with. Maybe there is some flexibility depending if you want to play Whispers or not. But I feel like every card in here that at least has the Machina trait and Gensetsu are basically required to be played in this list. So let's get into it here. Mecha Gun Wielder is our ideal one drop. We kind of want to see this every game on turn one if possible. It does give us an assembly droid. You rarely ever get the repair mode. It doesn't come up too often, and then they'll discard a Machina card on last word to draw a card. Comes up quite often if you want to get an alpha drive into the graveyard without after having to use it, or a mono or something like that, to just kind of get things rolling as well. And it also helps with a little bit with the consistency as well. It being a 1-2 is surprisingly does stick around a lot in this meta so far. I feel like occasionally it'll get sniped away by something, like if you're playing against Sword. Otherwise, it's going to get in for 1 usually, sometimes 2 depending on how slow the game is rolling out. Just a really great consistency card all around, just because you just need the Machina trait. The Machina trait is so important. Alpha Drive here is one of the key pieces for the deck itself. You need to see these in the graveyard at some point or in your hand. If you have this card in hand in combination with mono in the graveyard, that makes it so that your entire mono combo turn only costs 4 play points instead of 5 like it normally would, depending on, you know, if you hit the high roll on like turn 4, you're able to like pop off of the mono turn. Is kind of insane if you can do that. But if it's possible, it happens on some really very unlikely occasions, but it can happen. Card is great. Soul Conversion, we need draws in this deck. Soul Conversion is like the only way we're going to do that. We can trade in some of our tokens to basically get a draw 2. Also a really good target as well if you're not planning to pop off with mono anytime soon is Bone Drone itself. Bone Drone leaves Assembly Droid afterwards, which is nice. So there's some sticking power, and there's a lot of times too in certain matchups, if you know you have to go for the mono turn, summoning Bone Drones out through other effects is really powerful, just because it's more sticky to the board, meaning you're gonna usually have a Machina left over once this gets removed, or it's gonna take 2 removal or something like that to actually get rid of the extra Machina that gets summoned on the board through the Assembly Droid tokens. Sanguine Core is a necessary evil. This card is like a love-hate relationship, really. It adds consistency to the deck. Most of your deck is Machina trait, so it fairly ever whiffs, not that often. I've maybe had it whiff 1 time in like 10 or more games. But a lot of times you're just using this for if you don't have Mecha Gun Wielder, this is the other best turn 1 play. The only annoying part about this card is that you can't get it off your board until you get 5 Machina into your cemetery. And sometimes it takes a little bit going on if you don't have things to mill into your grave, or your opponent doesn't like trade in to your followers to build up some of your grave to get to that point. Also, one of the things to note about this deck is that your EX area actually does matter, especially once you get into 6, 7, 8, and so forth, higher play point turns. So leaving assembly droids in your EX zone can actually cost you from being in a good position to suddenly losing the game, just because, like, for example, Gensetsu is the important part in some matchups. You just need the tokens, and if you have something taking a spot in the EX zone, means 1 less Fox token you're going to get with your Gensetsu, which sometimes that's enough to like lose the game. So it's a love-hate relationship with Sanguine Core, but it is what it is. We just need it for the consistency and another good turn 1 play when possible. I'm going to skip Bone Drone because we already talked about mono. Garnet Rebel here. This is our girl. This is our win condition a lot of the times. And when I say win condition, she doesn't necessarily always win you the game unless like you get double mono off in a game. Sometimes in those cases, she wins you the game in that sense. But a lot of times too, mono just sets up so that your other things later on can win you the game, or put so much pressure on your opponent that they can't really answer your board in that sense. And then you're able to win the game through that. So Mono herself is a 2-drop 3/2, evolves for 1, but only can evolve if you have 5 Machina followers on the field. That's why it's very important. And please note, it does say Machina followers, so if you have the Sanguine Core on the field, you still can't evolve this, even though it's Machina trait. And when it comes out on the board too, it always, essentially, you're always going to spend by banishing 2 Machina cards from your cemetery to summon Assembly Droid, because this always gets you an extra follower on board, which is important, which means on a lot of cases, if you only need 2 more mono plus the effect will get you the 2 extra Machina to be able to do the Evo. And what's so powerful about this card is the Evo side. It has Storm innately, so sometimes you will just Evo this card even if you can't use the Alpha Drives, just because it's 5 Storm damage sometimes. But ideally, you want to be able to pay 2 and banish an Alpha Drive from your cemetery to give each Machina fall on your field +2/+2 and rush, and you can only activate this once per turn. This includes herself, so she becomes a 7/6. So a lot of times you are going to be swinging in, most likely for 10 or more damage, depending on what was left on your board before you played Mono herself, because she's been swinging in for 7. If you have like one Assembly Droid that lived cross turn, that's an extra 3 damage that's coming in. And you got to remember too, these Machina followers on board will gain rush if you just play them that turn, so it can help clear out the board and create some space for you. A lot of other times too, you just kind of hold back your followers that don't have Storm, because you can set it up so it's harder for them to deal with your board, and then you're able to swing in next turn with those followers. Of course, you got to make sure your life total is in a safe range, so you don't just get OTK'd that turn after you play Mono. If you misplay with this deck a lot, you will be in a lot of positions, especially if you don't get the correct draw order, or you make a mistake early on by like putting a follower into engaged by accident or something like that from swinging into something because you think you need a trade. You just end up losing the game because of that, because you might have needed that extra 3 damage and so forth to actually close out games. What's interesting about this deck is that you have to know when to hold back and when to actually push all your chips in and say all in, because there are times where you just need to trade like 8 life 1 turn to be able to set up the kill. That's all that matters here. The deck is very much a mid-range deck that's looking to sneak in, get a big push of damage, and hopefully close out the game either through some attrition through Gensetsu or Technolord, for example, to help do the extra burn or get you another mono to hand and so forth, to just actually push that damage to close out the game. The deck is very interesting. I think if you play it not really understanding how you need to be playing into every matchup, I think you're going to come away with the realization that, like, wow, this deck doesn't feel that good, even though it was played so heavily in Japan. What is so great about this deck is that it sneaks in between like the timings where certain decks like Sword or Forest are looking to win the game. It can sneak in that way, but it has an alternate win condition too, and you got to know which one of those conditions you have to be hitting in each matchup. And I think the really good mono players are going to be able to recognize what you need to be doing in each matchup and like how to get to that position on the board. I've learned from playing the deck a lot is, like I said, you just got to trade some of your life away. Sometimes it might feel bad just to be able to set up a really good mono turn to kind of win the game from there. If you are afraid and constantly like playing to control the board, you're probably going to run out of hand size so fast it's not going to matter. So there's a lot of times too where you just don't want to swing in with your droids or anything because you need them to survive to the next turn, and you'll make it as hard as possible for your opponent to remove as much as possible. That's like the most important part of this deck. Robo Goblin is another great card here that generates itself as a Machina card, but on Evo here, it will also summon an Assembly Droid into the field, which is really good for you. So you can play this on turn 2 or turn 3 to get 2 followers on the board. Don't swing them in, and then possibly on turn 4 or 5, if they're still there, you get a mono and Evo it as well, which is an insane play as well, because suddenly this is going to become a 5/5 and a 3/3 that are swinging in with your 7 attack mono, meaning you're going to push 15 damage in 1 turn, which is really great. One of the parts of this card, though, that I found to be quite surprising that I did not like is that you get a repair mode into your EX area when it does get sent to the graveyard, which sometimes will screw up your Gensetsu turns when you need 5 foxes. So you got to be careful on how you handle leaving the repair mode into your EX zone. Sometimes you just gotta like use it as soon as possible or get it out of the zone, especially if you know you have to go into a Gensetsu turn. That's the most important part about this deck, is once again understanding when is the main game plan to Gensetsu and wait for mono, or play mono into Gensetsu. It's a very weird balancing act you have to handle with this deck. Forbidden Art here, this is an insane card actually. You get to select the enemy fall on the field and deal 4 damage to it for only 2 play points, which is insane. Obviously it doesn't have quick, but generally you're not leaving up any play points in this deck really to respond that often. But the big thing here is it combos with Nicola Forbidden Strength, which is a really amazing card for this deck. It's insanely how good this card is. And deal 6 damage, so it answers most things. It answers, for example, I'm forgetting her name now, but the fox girl, not the fox girl, but the cat girl, whatever, in Sword, the new 6-drop. This will get rid of it and so forth with Nicola on the board. It's just, you'll be surprised how well this card is at just controlling the board, especially into other matchups where like they play a 4 health follower on the board on like 2 or 3, and then with 2 play points you get to just answer it and you'll feel completely fine, and then you have that in the grave later for Nicola to pop off with. I'm just going to jump over to Nicola here. This card is so good. So the bury the top 2 cards of your deck is super important. This helps you get to the 5 Machina cards in grave a lot of times. It also helps you high roll into putting Alpha Drive into your graveyard sometimes, or a mono into your graveyard if you happen to not have one in there, or you, like for example, you have Alpha Drive in hand but you don't have a mono. This will help you high roll into those situations, which is really important. But the big part here we play a 3 of here for the Evo is that its on evolve effect is insane. You select a Machina card that costs 2 or less in your cemetery and put it into your EX zone, and then it costs 2 less that turn. So obviously the main combo here is Forbidden Art when you need that control, but a lot of times too you're just looking to do things like summon Bone Drone. Bone Drone is going to be a sticky flower that's going to be stuck there, and you have a 4/4. Don't engage these flowers, don't swing with them, leave them on the board. Another one too is obviously Robo Goblin is a fine pick as well. A lot of the times if you need to, mono could be a pick as well. You know, if it comes down to the point, things like that. Generally you don't want to get mono because usually if you play mono you want to evo it in the same turn. But yeah, just Nicola is just such a great powerful card for what it does. It can either build you a wide board or can also help control the board in that sense. If you play with this card, you'll feel how strong it is. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some version of like a Control Abyss list or some other Tempo Abyss list out there that would be playing this card anyway, just because of how strong it is with some of the Machina stuff as well, mostly the Forbidden Art thing. But the fact that it's kind of Trey locked to Machina might make it so that this card doesn't see play outside of this deck, but it's just a really powerful card. Just to make that as clear as possible, you need to always be playing this as a 3. You need to play 3 of the Evo because you can get it quite often. And another reason we want to play it at 3 is because Aina Amethyst Rebel, this card, even though it has such a small stat line, does so much work for the deck. There are turns where, like on turn 7, when you have 7 play points, you can do plays like Aina Amethyst Rebel onto the board, summon mono from the deck. Mono generates another token by banishing 2 from the grave, so that's 3 followers off of this 4 play point turn, 4 play points so far. Then with the last 3 play points, you can pay 1 to Evo and then pay 2 to banish the Alpha Drive to buff everything immediately. It's a easy way. This card makes it very easily for you to go from 2 followers on board that lived cross turn, like if there was 2 tokens that lived, suddenly you play this, you have mono and a full board and evoed and got to play off the Alpha Drive combo, and then you can start pushing in for what, that's like 13 damage immediately on the board with the 2 tokens, for example, that lived, plus the 7 for mono. It's insane how powerful this card actually feels once you start playing with it. When you first look at the stat line and think about the card, you're like, dang, I'm forced to play this card because I just need the Machina and I need the extra consistency tool. But once you start playing with this card, you'll feel the power that it has. Obviously 2/2 stat line is not the best in the world, but it is what it is, and it feels good when it helps you win games that way. And then the extra healing occasionally does feel great. The last word is, give your leader +2 when this card goes to the grave. Very powerful card for what little it provides you, essentially. I really like this card. Finally, we're going to talk about Gensetsu here. So mono is not always able to be the one thing that kind of wins you the game every time. As some game plans into like control and stuff, you're just required to play something else to get to the game, get to the point where the game is over. And Technolord is not always going to be enough for you to do that. That's where Gensetsu comes in and like fixes a lot of the issues. The one thing is, after a lot of your really good pop-off mono turns, your hand size will be relatively small, usually down to 3 cards at least. And having a Gensetsu come out and just fill the board for you after one mono turn sometimes is enough to put too much pressure on your opponent. They can't really get through every one of your wards. And if they do, they're just making Gensetsu stronger. And then you can swing in to kind of close out the game from there with your Foxes and Gensetsu itself. Otherwise, Gensetsu's Foxes will help you clear the board and everything. We do only play 2 of the Evo because generally by the time you play the second Evo, the game should be closed out for your opponent from actually winning, unless they have a way to burn you out and so forth, or get through your wards to win the game that way. But generally, it's after you've used your resources for the mono turn, and Gensetsu is a great backup plan. And sometimes too, Gensetsu might actually be the main game plan. It might actually be you play cards to the board, you kind of play a little bit control against like maybe aggro matchups and stuff like that, where you're actually running in your followers, not really caring to build up the good crazy mono turns. But you go ahead, swing this into bring Gensetsu out, and then suddenly you take control of the match. And then if you happen to go into a mono turn afterwards to kind of close out the game, which happens occasionally, but usually after the second Gensetsu, for example, the game's kind of over. But yeah, you just got to know which matchups Gensetsu is more important than mono, and what matchups mono is more important than Gensetsu. It's very interesting on that stuff. Next, Technolord. This is just a consistent card. It's very, very powerful in the sense that if your opponent, especially if they're in, like, for example, the sword matchup, Miss Lena, that was her name. If they play Miss Lena, you can respond with Technolord, blow up their follower, search your deck for either Alpha Drive or Mono to like kind of set up your next turn, and then Technolord, leave it standing, obviously, and then it becomes an 8/8 next turn if they don't get rid of it, which is scary. It definitely pushes them in the direction of like, you're going to have a lot of damage next turn if you don't deal with this, or if they don't end the game that next coming turn. It's surprising how often Technolord helps you kind of close out games too. There are times when your opponent heals in the game, you got to understand what kind of reach you actually have, because sometimes it's more important to get the 3 damage to your opponent's leader, your enemy leader, than it is to like search out an extra card. You got to make sure you understand your win conditions in these games and how much actual reach you have, because sometimes you need Technolord to deal that 3 extra damage to make sure your mono turn is enough to actually close out the game. And we'll go back really quick to the couple cards I missed here. Mech Wing Angel is just another good Mech Wing or Machina card. It's one of your other few wards to kind of slow things down, and the Fanfare gets you the assembly droid into your EX zone, so you can bring it up when you need it for building up your board a little bit more. The secondary effect actually is weird in the sense that you think it would come up more often, but sometimes it doesn't. So like occasionally you might be able to get an extra like damage in through Mech Wing Angel and so forth. This is another card that's very often grabbed off of Aina here, because this coming out, if you need the ward, clear something with the tap effect as well. The other card you would be also grabbing if you have an extra play point is Nicola off of Amethyst, as well as a good way to clear the board and start presenting like a lot of push next turn for damage. This card is just like, it's weird because I want to like this card a lot, but at the same time I don't like it, because it's surprisingly how few games you actually get to use a secondary effect, but when it goes off, it does feel very, very good. The final card, this is kind of one of your slots where it's kind of your tech area. You can play Whispers of the Dream here, which I like a lot because one, it does mill you a card, which means you're going to possibly add one more Machina card into your graveyard to activate certain effects. Maybe you high roll and throw a mono in there and you already have Alpha Drive in your hand and so forth. But this is a really good answer to a lot of turn 3 plays your opponent might do, especially in the matchups where you have to go kind of slower and you can't just like throw things out. It's not consistent. Obviously, you only play a 2 of it, comes up occasionally. Otherwise, if you don't like this card, you can move it in for something else. But this kind of makes sure that the early game is kind of in your like wheelhouse for the most part, if you do draw into this in certain matchups when you do happen to need it. For example, like getting rid of a 5/4 fairy dragon or something is easily just do this, remove it, and you don't have to worry anymore, which is very, very nice. This also removes things like Baleon and so forth, those 3-cost followers. There's a lot of 3-cost followers that just snipe away. You have 2 play points left, and then you could just like play Robo Goblin or something like that. Surprisingly, card is very good. I do recommend you playing with this card, but this is definitely room to move. If you want to add 2 other cards in, you can go ahead and do that if you like it, so forth. But yeah, that's the deck's general game plan and everything, like I said, you got to really pay attention to what is your actual win condition. How much life can I trade now to make sure my next turn mono is going to pop off as hard as possible? I think that's going to be the big difference between people who play this deck casually and the people who play this deck at like the highest level possible. You have to really be in depth and understand like your next couple turns ahead, like how do I get to the actual win condition. You don't play the game to trade followers in to like control the board at all, otherwise you'll probably run out of resources too quickly for you, and then you'll feel like the deck is horrible. Some of the issues with the deck obviously are other control decks will just like bully this deck a lot. Those are the games where you got to understand like I need to play more towards Gensetsu and make them waste some of their resources to like clear the board with, like, for example, Send Them Packing is a card that will probably come up a lot this meta because Natura Forest is probably one of the better decks in this format right now, and it's like a mid-rangey control deck that has a really good board clear and like as a payoff. So going into Gensetsu, forcing them to kind of bait them out of using the Send Them Packing and then heading into the mono turn feels really good. You just got to understand these things in each matchup as you go along and figure that out yourself, and then make the decisions from there. Do I go for the mono? Do I go for the Gensetsu? Am I playing a longer game? Am I trying to play a shorter game? Sometimes you have to all in and hope they just don't have the answer too. It's one of those decks where I think it's high risk, high reward is what you're getting. But so the games where you mess up on, you feel miserable because you don't feel like there's an actual way to win the game because you've either lost too many resources or the cards aren't coming together, or you've made one mistake and instead of like searching a specific card off of like Technolord, you ended up doing 3 damage and you needed it, or vice versa, where you needed the 3 damage more than the extra card from Technolord, which has happened to me in a couple games before when I wasn't really consciously thinking of how I'm going to be pushing damage over the next course of the next 2 turns. But yeah, with that being said, I hope you guys like this deck a lot. I've been enjoying this exact build in my testing, and this is what I've been playing against as well when I test into mono. I think this is a very consistent, powerful list here. I think this is basically like 48 cards you have to, or sorry, not 48, 38 of these cards you have to keep in the deck, and then you have the 2 flex spots there where Whisper of a Dream for me is being used right now. But yeah, with that being said, guys, if you enjoyed this deck profile and stuff, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It does, keep me going on this channel. I should be having a few more BP7 deck profiles coming out later this week as well. But with that being said, guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. Later, everyone.